Daryl Recommends Podcast is a podcast recommending series and shouldn't be mistaken as a reviewing one. Opinions about each show are my own and should not reflect what each podcast has to offer. Content warnings aside, I believe if any recommendation in my series interests you, you should give it a chance, regardless of how I personally feel about the show.
We start in the skies above London. It's not particularly smoggy or anything like that. There are huge shining brass roofs sort of spread out, and the city looks physically raised. You see that the Thames runs into it at one end, pretty much disappears underneath the profusion of buildings, and then comes out the other side of London. But while it's there, it's pretty much obscured. There's all these enormous buildings, bridges, bridge work. It's very shiny. It's almost suspiciously sort of clean and tidy. It all looks very, very nice. Heading in a bit closer, you do start to see, there's some steams coming up from like manhole covers and the cracks and things like that. But there's not the smog that you'd expect for a big, big city. There's an overground monorail which is running in from sort of the southeast, which seems to be running straight into the city. As you're looking, a train's running by. It's a big deal. It's huge. It's very, very opulent. It's moving at a fair lick, maybe with a couple of sparks of lightning coming out the back as it goes. Zooming in a bit closer, you start seeing the streets are filled with people.
Thomas Edison's simulacrum may be the world's most fantastic piece of technology to date, but when the blueprints are stolen, it's up to the London Rangers to save the day. I'm sure they'll come up with a better party name eventually. Rusty Quill Gaming is a tabletop RPG podcast using the Pathfinder system. The story is set in a steampunk world where magic and technology are almost one and the same. The story is fully complete with 218 episodes, not including multiple spin-off story arcs. So this show, I really enjoyed this a lot. It took me a little bit to get into, but I think after the prologue section of the game, then it gets pretty good from there. I very much enjoyed the characters. If you're a fan of Rusty Quill other projects, you may be familiar with some of the cast, such as Ben Meredith and Lydia Nicholas, Helen Gold, and then also some other people who have shown up in shows like the Magnus Archives, like James Ross and Bryn Monroe. But I very much enjoyed the story arc that this whole campaign went to. And it's very interesting, the setting. I really like the steampunk world idea. I think it was kind of weird that they decided to make a bunch of the main NPC characters based off of actual dead people, such as one of the most major NPCs where you probably have seen him if you're at least slightly familiar with Rusty Quill before listening to the show, but Oscar Wilde is the main character. There's also Marie Curie. There's also Isaac Newton, Franz Kafka, and a bunch of other different characters who show up. Howard Carter's another one. And yeah, it's just actual dead people, but now they're in a D&D fantasy world. Yay! But I enjoyed all of the game. Wilde is probably my favorite character in the whole podcast, to be for real. And I just love his and Zolf's developing queer platonic relationship. It's so good. And it's just great all in general. I thought the world building was very creative, and how they wanted to combine actual our real life world with this fantasy D&D world, and I thought the setting was very unique in that way, and how they decided to go about with previous lore that they came up with, involvement of Rome and the fall of the Roman Empire versus society now being kind of ruled by dragons, basically. And it was just an interesting way to go about with it. Everybody's every character's individual story arc has just been very fun and interesting. Bertie is probably the worst fun character to watch. So fun to watch. Such a horrible guy. We'd love to see him fail. Just great. His podcast is also very unique to me personally, in which this is the only podcast that I have ever listened to. And keep in mind, I was there when both the finales for the Magnus Archives and the Silt Verses was out. I've been listening to Malevolent since the beginning of season 3. I listened to a bunch of other different shows, but none of these shows have ever made me cry. They have come close, but none of them have ever made me cry. This is the only podcast that has ever made me cry. Not only has this podcast made me cry, but this podcast has had me crying twice. Specifically twice. No other podcast has gotten me to cry. This podcast has gotten me to cry twice. And It's like, it was very unexpected, but oh my goodness, the show just gets so good, and like, Lydia Nicholas, I am coming for you. In case you couldn't tell, she's Sasha is my favorite of the not the NPCs, the player characters, but oh my goodness, Lydia Nicholas, you certainly are a very good actor. But I thought the setting was very interesting. So a lot of like what they do is they're traveling around mostly Europe. There's parts of it where they're like in Egypt. There's like an arc where they go to Japan, but it's mostly in Europe. And if you're a bit worried about the fact that they do go to like places that are outside of Europe, Alex Newell, who's the DM, does not try to put on a foreign accent. So if you're kind of worried about it getting pretty racist, he specifically goes, I'm not going to do that. That does not avoid him putting on a French accent during the French arc, though, so if you want Alex Newell being French, there you go. But overall, I thought this was very good. I thought the ending was a bit underwhelming compared to, like, a lot of the stuff that happens in the show, because the show, like, they literally almost, at, like, one point had, like, they had like multiple points where they almost had like full team party kills, and so this show does get a bit dicey at some points, but like it's not a bad ending. It's not like a disappointing ending. It's just not the most like overwhelming ending that I thought it could have been. But that's fine. I still very much enjoyed it, even if it wasn't what I was expecting, but that's okay. But if you also enjoy queer characters, there are multiple queer characters in the show. James Ross ended up leaving this podcast midway through it, because I think he explains in the show, but yeah, he had a kid. And so that's when Helen Gould joins the show as Azu, which I probably should get around to explaining the characters too, but they joined the show as Azu, and Birdie is gone. The thing with this game also is that they do switch around player characters. If you're familiar with shows like Critical Role, which I know Critical Role at one point one of the characters ends up like dying, so he gets replaced. But in terms of like constant, almost not super constant, but a lot more than I've seen in like other singular long like D&D actual play shows, which I don't listen to a super ton of them, but I've listened to a few. If I'm thinking of like some of the popular ones like Critical Role and the Adventure Zone, but they actually do kind of switch up party members quite a bit. I think Hamid is the only character who has been there since like the beginning of the game, and everybody else has been switched around once. But so like their beginning party starts off with Hamid, who's their halfling sorcerer, then there's Zolf, who's their dwarf cleric, Birdie, who's their human fighter, and then Sasha, who's their human rogue. And then Zolf ends up leaving the party, and Ben Meredith replaces him with Grizzop, and then later they get Azu, who is Grizzop's their goblin paladin, by the way, but then they get Azu, who is their orc paladin, and then after that they later get Zolf back, and they get Sel, who is their halfling artificer, and pretty much Hamid, Azu, Sel, and Zolf are like their like final party, because they always consistently have just 4 players in the game at a time. But it's very good. It's very good. One of the things I enjoyed most with this show, compared to some other like actual play shows I have, is I very much enjoyed how the characters and the NPCs like are so entwined with each other. There's like a couple of examples that do this. I'm primarily thinking of seasons 1 and 2 of the Adventure Zone, and as well as like season 4. But I love how the NPCs in Rusty Quill Gaming also feel like not like background fodder to like what the player characters are doing, but they feel like a part of the story, and that's one of the things that draws me the most to Rusty Quill Gaming as like a narrative piece. It's just how like put together of a world this is with these characters in it, and I think that's like also a part of it is like a contribution to like how good of a writer Alex Newell is. Like I listened to Rusty Quill Gaming, I think maybe the year after the Magnus Archives ended, so like before like the Magnus Protocol came out, and outside of just like his work with that, wasn't really familiar with him as like a writer, but like I think Rusty Quill Gaming is like an example of like how like good of a writer Alex Newell is. So if that's something that interests you, and if you've been enjoying like the statements, the episodes specifically that Alex has wrote for the Magnus Protocol, then you should also check out Rusty Quill Gaming, because I think it's a fantastic story. And of course I have to attribute part of that also to the players as well, because at least in my opinion, D&D shows are the like how they come out to like an audience perspective, I think is based both on the player but then also on the DM. And like the DM can set up the world and create the NPCs that the players will interact with, but how the players decide to interact with the characters also adds on to that. And I think that like overall all 6 people involved in the show did a really great job. And it's just very great. And like I mentioned earlier, if you want a queer platonic pairing that makes you go feral, might be a show for you. There is some romance. If you're somebody who likes romance in your tabletop RPG games, there's some romance too. But like I forever just like I adore Zolf and Wild's relationship. It's just so good, and this whole world is just like a fun little world building place to like dig your head around when you're like thinking of stuff where it's like, oh well, if this and this and this and that and that and this. And I kind of wish that they were able to have the opportunity to explore more of the world. Like most of the story is focused in like European countries, and then there's some where they're a bit in America and a bit in Russia, and there's like a whole story arc that takes place in Japan. But it would have been cool to, like, because they were talking about, like, well, this is how Australia is, like, and, like, and, like, America has some, like, really interesting lore. And I think it also attributes partially to the time period that this game takes place in, because it's kind of, like near the end, they're like, it's in 18, but they don't give, like, an exact date of it. It's just kind of like a, yeah, you could assume this game takes place sometime in the 1800s. So, yeah. I do have to go into content warnings, though, because there was one joke that I saw, like, when I got into the Magnus Archives at first. And I keep mentioning the Magnus Archives, but it's Rusty Quill, so unfortunately sometimes that comes up. But around the time when I got into it, I kept seeing this, like, joke that people were saying that the genres for the shows were wrong, and that Rusty Quill Gaming is actually the horror show. And there is some pretty horrifying stuff that happens in Rusty Quill Gaming. It's mostly, like, in the vibes, but there's, like, a whole huge thing with, like, mind control. A lot of murder, obviously. You can't avoid that with a tabletop RPG show. I do also want to put a content warning for Birdie. Birdie is very much, like, based off of, like, people like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. He's that kind of character. And James Ross, I guess from what I understand is that James Ross saw how many people liked Bernie, because Bernie is really funny, and he just progressively just keeps making Bernie worse and worse and worse. So, content warning for Bernie. And if you are, like, sensitive to things like hive minds, you don't like seeing a lot of character death, because a lot of characters die, and there's some, like, story arcs in this that just get very oof. Major themes of depression and, like, suicidal ideation. So if that's, like, something that you don't like in your shows, be warned with that. But I think, like, at the very least, if you could listen to something like the like Critical Role, I think you would be fine with Rusty Quill Gaming. I've only been listening through like Vox Machina at the moment, and it's generally similar vibes, minus the like mind control and Birdie content warnings, but that's really it. But overall, I really enjoyed this podcast. It remains consistently good throughout the story. Even if I did say earlier that I thought the ending was underwhelming, it still was like a good ending, and I very much enjoyed it, and it takes like a very surprise turn that makes sense, but very surprising. So take that as you will. And I hope you guys will give this one a listen. I think it's a bit underrated for a tabletop RPG podcast, and I would love to see more stories in this world. I don't think they're going to make more. I'm still mourning Masks, so the campaign that they were running for Chapter Multiverse. But yeah, I just really enjoyed Rusty Quill Gaming, and I think it would be cool if they someday decide to re-explore this world again. However they decide to do it. Anyway, I think that's all for now. As always, You can find me on my social media links down below. I've been revamping that stuff. In case you couldn't tell, I had to edit my border again. But yeah, that's that. And if you want, I also think you should leave me a recommendation for more podcasts to listen to. I am always looking for new recommendations. I am currently in the middle of slowly, eventually making my way through Critical Role. But I am also re-listening to a show right now, so I haven't been listening to anything new in a while because it's been taking me a while to re-listen to some stuff. So yeah, and it's also my excuse to like get through this list of shows I haven't recommended yet. So there you go. But you could still give me recommendations because that will influence what I listen to next. So take that as you will. I hope you guys have a good day and goodbye.